defeat of Turkey in the First World War, the famous leader Jamal Mustafa Ataturk declared that Turkey would be a secular state, and the Hagia Sophia was turned into a museum. Nevertheless, there was definite prejudice against Christianity, and in latter years this prejudice has become, I think, even more dominant, and it's not an area that's conducive to evangelism. There's a lot of prejudice against Christianity, but nevertheless, God is working in that country now and drawing people to himself. We'd like to share some of the encouraging things we saw. But in relation to this, I want to draw your attention to what Paul writes in Romans chapter 10. Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Israelites is that they may be saved. For I can testify about them that they are zealous for God, but their zeal is not based on knowledge. Since they did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. Christ is the culmination of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. What Paul is saying about the religion of the Jews is true also of the followers of Islam. They try zealously to please God by their own works. They're very conscious of God, but they're trying to please God by their own traditions and by their own works. And like the Jews of old, in Paul's day and today, they do not understand that we are declared righteous through the atonement that Jesus was able to obtain when he died on the cross and bore our sins. And Paul realised this when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, and his life was transformed. And he was lost, but now he's saved. He's praying for his fellow Jews that they may be saved, that they may come to that knowledge of Christ just as he did. And that's what we ought to be praying for the Muslims, not just the Muslims, but for all people who have this wrong idea of how to be righteous before God. But I want to make the point, based on what Paul says, that people are either saved or they're lost. They're saved or they're lost. In the story about Zacchaeus, we have these words of Jesus in verse 10 of chapter 19 of the Gospel of Luke. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. And in Matthew 7 verse 13 and 14, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and many enter it. But small is the gate and narrow the way that leads to life, and only a few find it. Now, I don't know who is who ultimately. Maybe there's some people I think are lost, but they're actually saved. You know, but we must not be quick to judge. Only God ultimately knows who is who. But nevertheless, this line of demarcation still exists. People are saved or they're lost, and we ought to do what we can to evangelise them and pray. That's what Paul did. Pray that people will be saved. And I want to mention this theme particularly as I go through this talk. Now I want to talk briefly about our trip to Turkey. This was organised by Steve, who was a lead missionary with our former church, St James Croydon. He and his wife came to St James in '94. They were workers with Campus Crusade. But in 2004, he went with his family to be missionaries in Turkey. They don't call themselves missionaries. They need to be more circumspect. They call themselves Christian workers in order to sort of not evoke hostility. But they're there to win people to Christ and to build them up in the faith. Now, as it turns out, Joe and I were the only ones on the tour. But it was a fascinating time. It was good to be with somebody who knew the language. He arranged the places where we stayed, he arranged the places where we would visit, and it was a fascinating time. The tragedy of Turkey, from our point of view, was that it was once the centre of Christianity. Paul was born there, A lot of the activity we read of in the book of Acts took place in that part of the world. And the archaeological excavations that have been taking place and are now taking place just highlight this ancient Christian civilization. And it's interesting that the guides at the tourist site, they need to know their Bibles in order to give correct information to the people who are tourists. Many of whom are Christians and want to see the sites. So when we went to Ephesus, the man there, he was a Muslim, actually used his commentary from the Acts chapter 19. We saw the theatre where the riot took place. We saw the evidence of the worship of Artemis. It was because of the success of Paul's ministry that those who made the idols for the worship of Artemis instigated the riot because they were losing their trade. And we saw all this, we saw evidence of Christianity. In Ephesus, there's a church dedicated to the Apostle John, who is said to have lived and died there, and also there's a house where Mary is said to have lived. So even though the country is Islamic, there's this testimony of the gospel through archaeology. We visited Laodicea, and that's a more recent archaeological excavation, and one of the most recent excavations is of a house church that goes back to the 4th century. And one of the Christians there had turned one of his rooms into a chapel where the people used to meet, and they were digging this out as we were there. One of the most fascinating places we visited was Cappadocia. Cappadocia was famous for the 3 Cappadocian fathers, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory Nazianzus. These were stalwarts of the Orthodox view of Jesus, because the 4th century was a time of great theological controversy. But it's interesting that when we went into one of the caves where the Christians used to meet, Basil had painted biblical scenes on the walls. This was the point of view of evangelising the people, many of whom were illiterate. And our guide had pictures of these paintings in a book, and he explained them to us. They were scenes from the life of Jesus. And in explaining these pictures, he was actually telling us the gospel. And we asked him, do you believe this? Oh, no, he doesn't believe because he's a Muslim. But nevertheless, there's this witness to the gospel through these archaeological discoveries. Now, Turkey, as I've already said, is strongly Muslim. But despite the history, there are some ancient Orthodox churches, but the Christian population is only 0.21% of the population and shrinking. According to Operation World, which is the calendar I use for praying, there are 7,267 evangelicals, 7,005 charismatics, and 228 Pentecostals. But the number is growing. That is, it's growing of those who actually take the scriptures as their authority. Steve told us that in 2007, they saw one person converted, one person come to a personal faith in Jesus. In 2008, there were 7, and in 2009, 14. In 2010, there were 20, 2011, 33, in 2014, there were 40. Now, a country which is 99% Islamic, they're insignificant figures, but the church is growing, and people are encouraged as they are converted. In 2007, 3 Christians were killed in Turkey. 2 Turks, 2 Turkish Christians, and 1 German. Nevertheless, the number of converts continue to increase. The highlight of our trip to Turkey was to attend a house church in one of the cities. The congregation met downstairs, and the Sunday school kids met upstairs. It was quite full, a lot of young families, a lot of young couples, and you could feel the presence of God. I mean, the worship was, even though we didn't understand the language, it was very uplifting. They weren't, and the music was indigenous, they weren't Turkish translations of Western hymns. They were Turkish hymns. But there was a real joy, and you felt the presence of God. And the worship was led by a very vivacious lady who was one of the leaders of the church. After the service, it was our privilege to have lunch with the leaders, and they shared their testimonies. The lady who led the worship came to faith after a period of depression. The male leader had a Christian girlfriend, and dreams were instrumental in his coming to Christ. He told us about them. He said in one of his dreams there was a hand coming down from heaven and heard a voice saying, "Give me what you've got." So he went through his pockets, didn't have much, but he handed it over. And then he said, "Who are you?" And the voice came back, "I am a descendant of Abraham." Now it may seem unusual, but this man who was a Muslim didn't even know who Abraham was. But there were a lot of different sects of Islam in Turkey. He might have, with divergent views, and he might have belonged to one of those. But anyway, that was one dream. Then he had another dream. And in this dream, his girlfriend, Christian girlfriend, was standing beside him. And there was a huge mountain in the distance. And he understood he was to climb the mountain. The voice told him to climb the mountain. But he knew it was impossible. He couldn't do it. And then his girlfriend said, "Don't worry, Jesus will climb the mountain for you." And so Jesus appeared and climbed the mountain, and the mountain disappeared. And it was a flat plain. And through these dreams, he came to understand what the gospel could do for him. And he became a follower of Jesus. And as soon as he told his family, he was kicked out of the house at 11 o'clock at night. And with nowhere to go, completely dependent upon Jesus. And then the first miracle occurred. He was walking along and looked down on the footpath, and there was a whole stack of money. So he was able to look after himself. And God provided for him. And now he's married to his Christian wife, it's his girlfriend, and they have a young boy, and that has helped bring some degree of reconciliation with his father. See, God often uses miracles to reveal himself to Muslims. Let me give you another example. I don't know exactly in which country this happened, except that it's a strictly Muslim country, and the names have been changed for security reasons. This is in the article that I read. It concerns a woman called Erin, who was committed to her local religion. Yet she always felt that there was a great gap between her life and what God surely must expect. And she was troubled by the fact that there was no solution to this gap, to this difference between herself and what the holiness of God. But she felt that surely God must have an answer to this problem. Anyway, she went to university in another city, and she visited her older brother who lived there. And she was struck by the beautiful poetry that he read, that he quoted. And she asked him about it, and he said that they were the words of Jesus from the Bible, that he had become a follower of Jesus. And she was fascinated and asked him if he had a Bible that she could read. And he did, and when she read it, she was amazed to find that God had solved the problem of the gap between herself and God. He had sent his son Jesus, and Jesus had solved the problem by dealing with her sin. And she became a follower of Jesus. When she told her boyfriend, Ishan, remember these are just made up names, on hearing that she had become a believer, he cut off the relationship because she was now the enemy. However, over the next few years, they shared texts from their sacred books. And eventually the words of Jesus melted his heart, and he became a follower of Jesus as well. Now, Erin didn't think he was real. And he said to her, don't you think that the God who saved you can save me also? And she realised that his conversion was authentic. Erin wondered how her brother had become a believer, and she asked him, and he told her this story. Some years ago, their young son, who was 4 years old, had a fever. The husband was away on military service, the wife was on her own, and she took him to the hospital to see if they could bring down his temperature. But there's nothing they could do. It still was above 40 degrees, this young 4-year-old boy. But they put cold towels on him to try and do that. But nothing seemed to work. Nothing seemed to bring his temperature down. And then he said to his mother, Mother, the light is calling me. And she said to him, and she was terribly afraid, said, don't go, don't leave me. And she rushed out to get some more cold towels to put on his forehead. When she came back, the fever had completely gone. And she said, what happened? And the little boy said, the man said that I'm not coming now, but I will come later. I said, what man? The man, he came and sat by my bed. And he said, I'm not coming now, but later. I said, what man? He said, don't you see him? The man over there with the holes in his hands. Anyway, I mean, Erin, this lady and her husband didn't know much about Christianity, but they knew who the man with the holes in his hand was because they'd seen pictures. So they went up to a foreigner's church and they made inquiries and they became believers. God revealed himself through that. Now, I don't want to imply, see, having dreams and that is quite a usual thing in Turkish culture. And I don't want to imply that Christians were always having supernatural dreams. You know, they grow in their faith the same way that we do. They read their Bible, they pray, they go to church, they worship. But often the original encounter is through something supernatural, like a dream or a vision. And it's happening today too. But I was thinking about it. And I thought, I didn't have a vision. And I didn't have a dream when I became a Christian. But it was supernatural. I mean, it was so simple. I was having Sunday school. And I kneeled down. And I knew that Jesus died on the cross for my sins. And I asked him to forgive me and to come into my life. And he did. It was so simple. But it had such a profound effect upon my life. That was supernatural. Every conversion is supernatural. And it's really encouraging to hear the testimonies of converts from Islam. We visited another couple who were missionaries and who also used to be members of the church at St James when I was there. They're now working in Turkey and they work in Bursa, and they've seen people come to faith. We met a couple of them. One lady felt that she had a conviction of sin, like the other one I told you about. And there was no solution in Islam, no forgiveness. But she found it in Jesus. So she and her husband became Christians. We attended a conference for the missionaries of Christian workers, as they call themselves. And at one point, they made sure the doors were locked so that people in the hotel where they were staying couldn't overhear what was taking place as they spoke about their work and what God was doing. It's interesting, one of the ladies, I was fascinated, her name was Laura Doon. You know, I don't know if you read the book Laura Doon, but she was named after her. And they worked in Turkmenistan, she went up with them. Now in Romans chapter 10, Paul prays that the Israelites would be saved. You see, prayer is the key to spiritual power. In Mark chapter 9, we have the incident of a father who brought his son to Jesus. He had a demon. The demon used to throw him to the ground and make him grow rigid and gnash his teeth. And the boy was in terrible torment. And he brought his son to the disciples. Jesus, at this time, was up the mountain. you might remember, and he was transfigured before Peter, James and John. And that was a transforming experience for them. Meanwhile, at the bottom of the mountain, these other disciples were having a very hard time because they couldn't cast the demon out. And there was a whole lot of turmoil going on, and the Pharisees and enemies of Jesus were arguing with them, and then Jesus appeared and he cast the demon out and the boy was healed. Later on, the disciples quite naturally said, why couldn't we cast it out? And do you remember what Jesus said? This kind can come out only by prayer. You see, Christian ministry and evangelism, just living a Christian life, is spiritual warfare. And there are demons that are widespread in our community. And people cannot become Christians unless the Holy Spirit is working. You see, people can't believe because Satan has blinded their eyes. They may be highly intelligent, they may be sophisticated, they may be very ethical, but they cannot understand that they are sinful and they say that only the Holy Spirit can do that. It's spiritual warfare. That's why we need to pray. That God will convict them of their sin. And we need to pray for the Jews, like Paul did, and for Muslims. And it's interesting, there's been a growing tsunami of prayer in recent years for the Muslim community worldwide. And there are special prayers that are put out at the Feast of Ramadan to pray for them, because often this time God will reveal himself to them. Remember, Jesus said to the Apostle Peter in Luke 22, verse 31, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. See, Satan wants to get at our Christian leaders and sift them as wheat. He wants the faith of believers to fail. He wants leaders to fail. And it's happening. We often see this. Leaders are falling away. And the Christian congregation are being sifted as wheat. Now, what did Jesus do? He said, I have prayed for you, Simon. That's what we need to do. We need to pray. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus said, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray, that you will not fall into temptation. We need prayer to resist temptation. We need to be praying all the time. And we need to be praying for the followers of Jesus. We need to be praying for our leaders, that their love will not grow cold and will be delivered from temptation. Our greatest need, I believe, is for an outpouring of the Holy Spirit in revival. And see, when the Holy Spirit is poured out, there is a deep experience of love. God loves Muslims, and he loves the Jews, and he loves the atheists. You know, we're in a society where there's a growing humanistic, secular, atheistic influence. It's growing and having an effect. And we need to pray for these people. I remember hearing of a signboard of the church in England. It said to our Jewish friends, Happy Passover. To our Christian friends, Happy Easter. To our atheist friends, good luck. You see, because what have they got? They've got nothing. They may be prominent. They may have but there's nothing. There's nothing in atheism. They're empty. There's an emptiness there. They need to know the love of Jesus. And we should be praying for them. And you remember what Jesus said to Peter? Could you not watch with me 1 hour? You know, I mean, we spend hours watching the tennis, maybe, or the cricket, or going to a movie. And the time factor is important. We've got to give time to this discipline. If we want to see God working powerfully, this is the instrument. This is our weapon. Andrew Murray once wrote, the man who mobilises the Christian church to pray will make the greatest contribution to world evangelisation in history. Our greatest need in Sydney and the Western world is revival. You know what we often do? We have seminars and we teach people techniques, and we need to pray. You know, we need to pray. One of the most compelling examples of the... Are you still with me?
Yes.
All right, okay, well, I have got a finishing time, but let me finish with this. One of the most compelling examples of the power of prayer I've ever read comes from the ministry of D.L. Moody, the 19th century evangelist, famous evangelist in the 19th century. Now, Moody was the minister of the biggest church in Chicago, but it was burnt down in the Great Chicago Fire in the 1870s. So, while it was being rebuilt, he thought he would go over to England and he would learn what he could from the great preachers over there, people like Spurgeon and others. He went and heard Spurgeon at the Metropolitan Tabernacle. And he learned. He didn't intend to do any preaching himself, he just intended to hear and learn from others. But one day he went to a meeting at Exeter Hall on the Strand. And during this meeting, it was just thrown open for anybody who felt they wanted to contribute a word. And Moody felt impelled to say something, which he did. And among those who greeted him after the service was a pastor who asked him to come and preach at his church the next day, morning and evening. And Moody agreed to do so. So he went to the church, it was full of people, but he found them very difficult to preach with. They were as hard as rocks. He felt his words were bouncing back and hitting him in the face. You know, they were like blocks of ice or stone. He could get no response from them. And he wished he hadn't promised to come back in the evening. But he had, so he did. Once more it was the same scene. People outwardly respectful, but no response. Until halfway through his sermon, he felt the people were listening. Their faces became more animated. He felt as if there's a wind had blown in through the windows and livened the place up. And so he decided, he was so impressed by this, he thought he would give an appeal at the end of the service. And he did. If anybody wanted to be a Christian, would they stand up? The whole pews of people stood to their feet. And he said to the minister who was sitting beside him, "What does this mean?" The minister said, "Oh, I don't know." He said, "Well, obviously they've misunderstood me," so he told them to sit down. And he repeated himself. He said, "After the service, after the benediction, we're going to have a meeting in the church hall, and this is only for those who want to become Christians. You're not Christians, but you want to become a Christian. This meeting is for you and only for you." But the aisles were packed with people trying to get to the venue. So Moody, no doubt, he explained the Christian life, how to become a Christian, and led them into a prayer of commitment. He decided, he had planned to go to Dublin the next day by ferry, which he did, but when he got there was a telegram from the minister saying, "Come back straight away, the church is packed." And so Moody came back, and he held 10 days of meetings in that church. As a result, 400 people were converted, and the impact was felt by all the other churches round about. There was a real revival. Now Moody was puzzled by this sudden change, and he thought there must be a cause, there must be a secret, there must be a reason for this. And he began to make inquiries to ferret out the cause. Anyway, eventually, this story came to him. There was a lady in that church who became sick, and her condition was worsened so that she was shut in and could no longer go to church. And she began to reflect on her life and thought, what have I done? She began to reflect on regret all the opportunities she'd missed to serve God. Thought, what have I done? Practically nothing. What can I do now that I'm shut in, that I'm an invalid? And so she thought eventually, I can pray. So she thought, I will pray. And God led her to pray for her church, to pray that the Holy Spirit will come down and awaken that church, that there will be a great movement of His Spirit. Now her sister was in contact with the outside world. Every morning when a sister came home from church, she'd say, anything new at church today? No. Sunday after Sunday? No. After every prayer meeting on Wednesday, anything significant about the prayer? No. Same deacons prayed the same prayers. It was totally predictable. And but she persevered. There was no response, there was no encouragement. Day after week, month after month, almost a year, she prayed. I always get emotional when I tell this story. I shouldn't. It always happens. You know, I think of this lady praying on her own. Only God knows. But there's this great movement of the Spirit as a result of her prayers. Anyway, I get quite emotional when I think of her. But anyway, one day a sister came and she said, guess what? We had a guest preacher today, an American. His name was Moody, I think. And the lady said, don't bring me any lunch. She trembled, she turned pale. She said, God is going to do something to our church. And that night, the Spirit fell. And later on, when Moody searched around, she said that she'd read an article sometime before in a magazine called The Watchman. And she knew the man's name was Moody, and it made her heart burn and come alive. And she prayed. God let it pray that man would come to her church and preach. And God answered that prayer. You see, now we need a revival like that. Now, revival is a sovereign act of God. We can't manufacture a revival, but we can pray. And that is, from the human point of view, that is the thing that we can do. I don't know whether you've ever heard of that. Have you heard of the Great Hebridean Revival? Well, in 1949 to 1952, there's a great movement of the Spirit. I won't tell you much about this except that it happened in the Isle of Lewis, in the Outer Hebrides. And it was a result of people praying that God would move. And there was a great movement from 1949 to 1952. There's a book about it called Sounds from Heaven. And that's, you know, if I can, and God is working in the Muslim world in answer to prayer. We need to pray. And God is, you know, if we want to see the Jews convert, I believe God has a plan for the Jews. You know, I believe that God has a plan for them. You know, and Paul said in the book of Romans, if their rejection means the incoming of the Gentiles, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? And so, you know, we need to be praying for the Jews. And many Jews are being converted, and Messianic assemblies are being set up. But we need to pray for secular humanists. We need to pray for our own society. You can feel it slipping away, can't you? And the greatest contribution we can make to our community is to pray for a great outpouring of God's Spirit. So that's all I want to say. I don't take up too much time, but prayer is a theme for me that I often speak about. And if I can just at this time encourage you to spend time in prayer for revival, for the movement of God's Spirit, then I think it will be worthwhile. Okay, thank you. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.